Question 105 of the Summa Theologica has 8 articles, so this is kind of a long one. It has to do with the change of creatures by God. And so, we have autonomy, we have free will, where God is not in our essence, because that would be pantheism. But at the same time, God is supreme, so he has the right to change us and to make changes within us. But to what degree does he actually do that? And that's what these 8 articles are going to have to do with. Article 1 says whether God can move the matter immediately to the form. Now, we talked about primary matter, which is in potentiality. We had a little bit of chat in the chat room from the last video about that. Very interesting concept. And so when the form and matter come together, you have a substance, you have a creature like this interesting chameleon that I have a picture here. But does God move the matter immediately to the form? Does he make that happen himself? This is a very short corpus. He says, God can move matter immediately to form because whatever is in passive potentiality can be reduced to act by the active power which extends over that potentiality. And of course, God has the power to do that, right? Therefore, since the divine power extends over matter as produced by God, it can be reduced to act by the divine power. And this is what is meant by matter being moved to a form, or for a form is nothing else but the act of matter. So that's not too surprising. I mean, when things are created and matter, unites with form, God creates it, so he has the authority to do that. It gets a little bit more complicated as we go along, but a couple of these articles, by the way, I think are really fundamental, really important. Not necessarily this one, it's good, but later on, I just want to highlight a couple that I think are really, really significant and very important to understand about our relationship to God. But this one says whether God can move a body immediately. Okay, can he move a body immediately? Here's a picture of a young lady. She has a body like any, creature would. He says it is erroneous to say that God cannot himself produce all the determinate effects which are produced by any created cause. Wherefore, since bodies are moved immediately by created causes, we cannot possibly doubt that God can move immediately any bodies whatever. This indeed follows from what is above stated. Therefore, as God can imprint form immediately into matter, as we learned in the last article, it follows that he can move any body whatever in respect of any movement whatever. So I don't think that comes as any big surprise to anybody that God has the power to move bodies if he so feels like it. Now, the next 2 are the ones that I think are particularly interesting, and I think are things that you got to understand if you're going to understand our relationship with God and providence and how God kind of rules the world. This one says whether God moves the created intellect immediately. Okay, what impact does he have on our intellect? And this I find really interesting. It's 2 paragraphs. I'm going to read it its entirety. He says, as in corporeal movement, that is called the mover, which gives the form that is the principle of movement, so that is said to move the intellect, which is the cause of the form that is the principle of the intellectual operation. I know that sounds kind of heavy, but our intellectual soul is what moves our body. It's what is the intellectual aspect of us. I think that's what he's getting at here. And what he's going to do here is kind of relate God as intellect itself to the created intellectual creatures like us and the angels, okay? So he says this is the movement of the intellect. Now there is a twofold principle of intellectual operation in the intelligent being. One which is the intellectual power itself, the power that we have to know and to exercise our intellect, which principle exists in the one who understands in potentiality, while the other is the principle of actual understanding, namely the likeness of the thing understood in the one who understands. Now this harkens back to passive and active intellect, where the active intellect is able to light up the phantasms and actually know something, but we know all things in potentiality. We're like a blank slate, right, that's ready to be filled, and once we come across things with our senses, we're able to know them, but we have a kind of a 2-part intellect. So a thing is said to move the intellect whether it gives to him whether it gives to him who understands the power of understanding, or impresses on him the likeness of the thing understood. So there's two things. We have the power to understand, and then we actually have the things that we are able to understand, the likenesses of the things. And remember, when we come to know something, it becomes a part of us. We take those forms into us, and there is a participation in our knowledge, in our epistemology with God, because those types, those forms pre-exist in God. Now, God moves the created intellect in both ways, for he is the first immaterial being, and as intellectuality is a result of immateriality, it follows that he is the first intelligent being. Okay, God is intelligence. He doesn't have intelligence. He is his intellect, right? It's all the same in God. Therefore, since in each order the first is the cause of all that follows, we must conclude that from him proceeds all intellectual power. So everything that the angel is able to do, anything the human being is able to do, flows from God because he is intellect itself. In like manner, since he is the first being and all other beings pre-exist in him as their first cause, it follows that they exist intelligibly in him. Okay, so we exist intelligibly in God, as does every other thing in the world. It pre-exists in him because he is intellect himself, after the mode of its own nature. For as the intelligible types of everything exist first of all in God, and are derived from him by other intellects, in order that these may actually understand, so also are they derived by creatures, that they may subsist. Therefore, God so moves the created intellect, inasmuch as he gives it intellectual power, whether natural or superadded, and impresses on the created intellect the intelligible species, and maintains and preserves both power and species in existence. Now, this was kind of challenging, but I think it's very, very fundamental, very important that, first of all, God gives us the power to have intellect in the first place. Okay, your dog doesn't have it, your goldfish doesn't have it, we do, the angels do. Okay, that power came from God. And then also, since he is intellect himself and all forms pre-exist in him, anything that we come to know is going to be done by him, either by impressing those forms like he does with the angels, where they're infused, or by our process of abstraction, where we come to know things, a process of coming to know God. So that's how I take this to mean that in both of those cases, God is supreme because he is intelligence. Now that's intellect, and now he's going to go in Article 4 to will, whether God can move the created will. Now, you might think at first like, no, God doesn't move the will because then that would take away our free will, right? But that's not what he's going to say here. Because remember, the will moves of necessity towards the good, right? We can't change that. Our will is always going to be directed to the good. God is goodness itself, and so God is moving us of necessity for our will. Now, we can choose between different goods because we have contingency, right? So that's kind of what he's going to get at here. Excuse me. He says, as the intellect is moved by the object and by the giver of the power of intelligence, as stated above, so is the will moved by its object, which is the good, as I just mentioned, and by him who creates the power of willing. Now, the will can be moved by good as its object, but by God alone sufficiently and efficaciously, for nothing can move a movable thing sufficiently unless the active power of the mover surpasses or at least equals the potentiality of the thing movable. Now, the potentiality of the will extends to the universal good. Now, this is really important, right? That we are naturally drawn to the universal good. That we can't change that. That's just the way it is. But our free will comes through choice. Now, when we get more into, we've talked about, human nature, and, especially as we get into more of the moral decisions and things like the human will, which we'll get into more later on in part 2, this is going to become much more detailed in the way that Thomas explains it. For its object is the universal good, just as the object of the intellect is the universal being. the relationship between intellect and will is really interesting. And it's something I can't say I 100% understand, but the two of them working together, intellect is as he said here, is directed towards being or truth, and the will being attracted to the universal good. And so all this working together with an intellectual creature is just absolutely fascinating. But every created good is some particular good. God alone is the universal good, whereas he alone fills the capacity of the will and moves it sufficiently as its object. In like manner, the power of willing is caused by God alone. It reminds me of that Augustine quote where he says, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, my Lord. All these other good things that we're going after participate in the goodness of God, but ultimately we're only drawn to universal good, which is God himself. For to will is nothing but to be inclined toward the object of the will, which is the universal good. But to incline towards the universal good belongs to the first mover, to whom the ultimate end is proportionate, just as in human affairs, to him that presides over the community belongs the directing of his subjects to the common weal. All right, so it's almost kind of circular in that God is the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, creates creatures, and then those creatures are drawn back to him, right, as truth, as goodness, through their intellect and through their will. Wherefore, in both ways, it belongs to God to move the will, but especially in the second way by an interior inclination of the will. I just find that so beautiful. I don't know if I explained it well enough, but hopefully some of that makes sense. And of course, you guys are really good about leaving comments, and anything that you can add to that, I'd really appreciate very much. Whether God works in every agent. Now, this is interesting because I see shadows. You tell me if you agree, of William of Ockham here, which he came, of course, after Aquinas. But tell me what you think about this. He says, now he's obviously not referring to Ockham, because Ockham, he wouldn't have known Ockham. But some have understood God to work in every agent in such a way that no created power has any effect in things, but that God alone is the ultimate cause of everything wrought. This was something that came the century after Aquinas, where they felt like some of the scholastics were stripping God of his omnipotence, and that God works directly with individual things, which is one of the bases of nominalism. For instance, that it is not fire that gives heat, but God in the fire, and so forth, which almost sounds a little pantheistic. But this is impossible, first, because the order of cause and effect would be taken away from created things, and this would imply lack of power in the Creator. Like I said, my guess is this is something that the Franciscans of the next century were going to somewhat rebel against, especially Occam. For it is due to the power of the cause that it bestows active powers on its effect. Secondly, because the active powers which are seen to exist in things would be bestowed on things to no purpose. If these wrought nothing through them, indeed all things created would seem in a way to be purposeless, if they lacked an operation proper to them, since the purpose of everything is its operation. Thomas is saying God creates things with certain powers, and then they are able to have some kind of autonomy in carrying out the operation for which they were created, and that means God doesn't have to work immediately and actively on every individual thing, which again I think is something that was definitely proposed in the next century. Thus then does God work in every worker according to three things. First, as an end, for since every operation is for the sake of some good, real or apparent, and nothing is good, either real or apparently, except as far as it participates in a likeness of the supreme good, which is God. It follows that God himself is the cause of every operation as its end. Okay, that goes back to what we learned about previously, how the will is always directed to the universal good, right? And that's something we can't change. Again, it is to be observed that where there are several agents in order, the second always acts in virtue of the first, for the first agent moves the second to act. This is an answer to God allowing things to act on their own, is that they only act on their own because of the permission, I guess you could say, or the first cause, or the universal cause, working through secondary causes. And thus all agents act in virtue of God himself, and therefore he is the cause of action in every agent. Thirdly, we must observe that God not only moves things to operate it as it were applying their forms and powers to operation, just as the workman applies the axe to cut, who nevertheless at times does not give the axe its form, but he also gives created agents their forms and preserves them in being. Therefore, he is the cause of action, not only by giving the form, which is the principle of action, as the generator is said to be the cause of movement in things heavy and light, but also in preserving the form and powers of things. And so I think Aquinas here is trying to walk a balance between falling into that trap of saying God works on everything immediately, because that would take some of the autonomy, some of the power away from creatures. But he also is saying nothing works in secondary and tertiary causes without the influence and the overall universal cause pulling all things in. So this is a very key theme within Thomistic philosophy when it comes to a lot of different areas, and we've talked about this a number of times already. I hope that makes sense. Article 6, whether God can do anything outside the established order of nature. He says a higher cause is not subjected to a cause of lower order, but conversely. An example of this may be seen in human affairs. On the father of a family depends the order of a household, which order is contained in the order of the city, which order also depends on the ruler of the city, while this last order depends on the king by whom the whole kingdom is ordered. So he's established a hierarchy, he's established order, as Thomas will always do. If therefore we consider the order of things depending on the first cause, God cannot do anything against this order, for if he did, he would act against his foreknowledge or his will or his goodness. Okay, so the universal cause can't be changed because that's what God has preordained, preordered, foreknowledge, right? Okay, but if we consider the order of things depending on any secondary cause, thus God can do something outside such order, for he is not subject to the order of secondary causes, but on the contrary, this order is subject to him as proceeding from him, not by a natural necessity, but by the choice of his own will. For he could have created another order of things. Wherefore, God can do something outside this order created by him when he chooses, for instance, by producing the effects of secondary causes without them, or by producing certain effects to which secondary causes do not extend. All right, so again, there's a theme that runs through this entire question, and it has to do with primary, first cause, universal cause, and secondary causes. Inside the secondary causes, God can kind of mess around with those a little bit because he can tweak them and alter them and change that order of nature, but not in the universal cause, because that would be changing himself. And he can't do that. So Augustine says God acts against the wanted course of nature, but by no means does he act against the supreme law, because he does not act against himself. I hope this is all making sense. It makes sense to me, and mostly, okay, not 100%, but if you're at like 90 or 95% of this, I think you're good. This is Article 7, whether whatever God does outside the natural order is miraculous. The word miracle is derived from admiration, which arises when an effect is manifest, whereas its cause is hidden. As when a man sees an eclipse without knowing its cause, as the philosopher says in the beginning of Metaphysics. Now the cause of a manifest effect may be known to one, but unknown to others. Wherefore a thing is wonderful to one man, and not at all to others. As an eclipse is to a rustic, but not to the astronomer, because the astronomer knows why it's doing what it's doing, but the rustic doesn't. And so to him, it's like, wow, look at this is crazy. But to the astronomer, they're like, hey, that's not that big of a deal. Now, a miracle is so called as being full of wonder, as having a cause absolutely hidden from all, and this cause is God. Wherefore those things which God does outside those causes, which we know are called miracles. And so it doesn't surprise God. Okay, the miracles don't surprise God because he orders them, but to us, we're like that rustic looking at the eclipse saying, oh wow, this is crazy, right? Article 8, the final article of this question, whether one miracle is greater than another. Nothing is called a miracle by comparison with the divine power, because no action is of any account compared with the power of God. That's what we just talked about. But a thing is called a miracle by comparison with the power of nature which it surpasses. So the more the power of nature is surpassed, the greater the miracle. Now the power of nature is surpassed in 3 ways. First, in the substance of the deed. For instance, if 2 bodies occupy the same place, or if the sun goes backwards, or if a human body is glorified, such things nature is absolutely unable to do, right? It doesn't do this. It's not in their nature to do it. And these hold the highest rank among the miracles. Secondly, a thing surpasses the power of nature, not in the deed, but in that wherein it is done, as the raising of the dead and giving sight to the blind and the like. For nature can give life, but not to the dead, and such hold the second rank of miracles. Because, an eye should be able to see, so it's not crazy for an eye to see, but if sight is restored to a blind person, that's out of the ordinary, right? But it's not. It's still natural for the eye to see, but it's being restored, and so that's the second grade. Thirdly, a thing surpasses nature's power in the measure and order in which it is done, as when a man is cured of a fever suddenly, without treatment or the usual process of nature, or as when the air is suddenly condensed into rain by divine power without an actual cause, as occurred at the prayers of Samuel and Elias, and these hold the lowest place in miracles. Moreover, each of these kinds has various degrees according to the different ways in which the power of nature is surpassed. Okay, so if it's like downpouring rain and you pray and then it abates a bit and it slows down, well, that might be a miracle, but it's just in the degree that it happened. And so you could, hopefully that made sense to you, the 3 degrees, how miracles are ranked, and I find that quite interesting. All right, that's question 105 of the Summa. I hope that all made sense to you. It's very important, and we will continue with this treatise on the conservation and government of creatures tomorrow with question 106. Thanks for journeying through the Summa with me. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us.